In the previous lecture, we set up the form and prepped the JavaScript code. Now we begin processing the data. Inside the main plugin file, I'm going to use the WP Ajax nopriv hook. This is important. Users who are not logged in should be the only ones to be able to create accounts. The function will use the same name as the dynamic hook. Inside the process folder, create a file named create-account.php and define the function here. Make sure to include it from the main plugin file as well. Inside this function, I'm going to create the output array with a status key and its value being 1. Immediately afterwards, I'm going to grab the _WP nonce field and store it in a variable called nonce. I'm going to check if it's available by using a PHP ternary operator. If it's set, I'll set this variable to the field. Otherwise, I'll just set it to an empty string. Next, inside a conditional statement, I'm going to use a function called WP verify nonce. This function will take in the nonce we were given and then the name of the action. If we go back to the shortcode function, you'll see we named it recipe auth. Pass that in as a string to the function. If the function returns false, then we'll want to kill the script with the output like we always do. I'm going to create an additional conditional statement to check if the rest of the post variables were set. If any of them weren't, then I'll just kill the script. After performing these simple checks, let's create variables for each of these post values. I'm going to sanitize each value with the sanitize text field function. The email will be sanitized with the sanitize email function. It works like the sanitize text field function except for emails. With the data being set, I'm going to use another conditional statement and perform quite a few checks. I'll be using the username exists and email exists functions to check if the username or email is already in use. These functions are provided by WordPress and will make the necessary SQL queries to check if these two values are taken. While I'm performing these checks, I'll check if the two passwords match, and I'll check if the email being submitted is a valid email using the isEmail function. The isEmail is another WordPress function that helps with verifying an email and its format. Be sure to check this conditional statement twice. Make sure your code matches mine. Pause the video if you need to. If any of these checks pass, I'm going to kill the script again. If the user has made it this far, then we'll begin creating the user. There are two functions available for doing this, the WP create user and WP insert user functions. Both do the exact same thing. The WP create user is a wrapper and a more simplified version of the WP insert user function. This may seem appealing, but it won't do for our purposes. I want to set more values than this function will allow, so we'll be using the WP insert user function instead. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to this function. As you can see, this function accepts an array of fields we can set. We won't be setting all of these, only the ones the user has submitted. Let's use this function now. This function will return an ID if successful. I want to save this ID for future use, so create a variable named userID and assign its value to this function. Pass an array and set the following fields. User login will be set to the username. User pass will be set to pass. We're passing this in as plain text, but you don't have to worry about it being saved as is. WordPress will take the time to salt and hash this password for you before inserting it into the database. User email will be set to the email. User nice name will be set to the name. The nice name is used to display a friendlier name to users rather than displaying the username. That's all you need to do to create a user. If we look at the documentation, you'll see a list of possible returned values. Here is what WordPress says about the possible returns. If successful, returns the newly created user's user_ID. If query fails, returns a WP underscore error object. So if this fails, we can definitely expect a WP error object. I'm going to create a conditional statement and use the isWpError function to help us identify if the value returned is an error object. If this returns true, then I want to kill the script and let the user know the registration was a failure. At this point, the user is completely registered. Something WordPress does is send an email to the admin and user about their registration. Let's also mimic this behavior for the user only. WordPress provides a function called WP New User Registration. This function will send an email to the user with their credential info. The first parameter is the user ID. The second parameter is deprecated, so you'll have to pass in null. The last parameter allows you to specify who should be sent an email. There are 3 possible values for this. You can set this to admin for the admin to get an email. There's also user if you want only the user to get the email. Lastly, you can set this to both for both admin and user to get the emails. I'm going to set this to user since I want the user to get the email. Now that the user has been created, we only have a few more things to do. This next step is completely optional, but I like to automatically log in the user after creating their account. To log the user in, we need to grab the user object. I'm going to create a new variable named user and assign its value to the value returned by the function getUserBy. This function will return a user object. It allows you to grab a user with numerous fields and values. Since we have the user ID, we'll just use that. The first parameter will be the string ID to specify that we want to grab the user by their ID. The second parameter will be the ID itself. This should return the user and all their properties. To log in a user, there are a couple of things we need to do. First, we need to let WordPress know about the current user. This will not authenticate the user, but simply tell WordPress that a user is now active within the system. Call the WP-SetCurrentUser function and pass in the user ID along with the user login. Next, I want to set up a cookie so that WordPress will remember this user for future use. Call the function WP-SetAuthCookie and pass in the user ID. This function has a second parameter which will remember the user even if they exit out of their browser. By default, this is false, which is what we want. The reason I want this is because the user may be registering on an insecure location. This cookie will only be active until the user exits out their browser. Next, I want to set off a hook using the doAction function. The hook I want to run is called WP-Login, and I'm going to pass in 2 extra arguments. I'm going to pass in the user login and the user object. This hook will allow WordPress itself to run any authentication settings and will allow for any other plugins to perform any setups when a user is logged in. After doing all of this, the user is now logged in. Before I move on, I want to inform you about a function called WP-Sign-On that does all this for us. But the reason we didn't use it is because it brings back mixed results upon first login. When a user logs in for the first time, there is additional setup that WordPress and additional plugins want to perform. By doing it this way, we make it easier to let those plugins do so. What I just showed you is a more definite way to log in a user for the first time. To end this function, I'm going to update the output status key to 2, then I will kill the script. This will let the script know the user has successfully created an account. We're almost done with the registration. Since the user is logged in after registering, then we should redirect them to the home page so that they don't have to stare at this page. Inside the front/enqueue function, I'm going to create another local variable named homeURL and set its value returned by the function homeURL. Pass in a simple / to let this function know you want the URL to the root page itself. We can now use this variable inside our script. Right after the status message, set the href property of the location object to the new localized property like so. You can now test this form. Make sure you are logged out or this form will not work. Try testing this form with invalid info. Then try testing it with valid info. You should see a success message for a brief moment and then be redirected to the home page. You should also notice that you are now logged back in by WordPress. This is exactly what we wanted. I'm going to log out again and navigate back to this page. In the next lecture, we'll work on making the login form work. It's very similar to what we did with the registration form.